This is commercial-free CNN Student News. I'm Carl Azus. It's good to see you this Thursday. First up, an American doctor in Liberia has tested positive for the Ebola virus. Dr. Rick Sacra, a Christian missionary, wasn't treating people with Ebola, but he is in the country that's been hardest hit by the latest Ebola outbreak. And that's one of 5 things to know about this virus. It's killed thousands in West Africa. Second point, it's a fever. Other symptoms are muscle pain, vomiting, bleeding. It's spread through direct contact with blood and body fluids. 3, there's no cure. About half of those who've gotten it have died. Quick treatment with fluids, vitamins, and medicines seems to help in some cases. 4, there is an experimental drug being used on some victims. Quantities are extremely limited, and its effectiveness isn't proven. Some who've gotten it have survived, some have died. 5, this outbreak, the worst so far, has been largely limited to West Africa, and you're about to see how Ebola has turned parts of Liberia into ghost towns.
Half the population here have either died or fled. Many not even stopping to carry their belongings.
Why are these houses abandoned?
Kazali Johnson told us he lost his 8-month pregnant sister, his brother, niece, and many others. Too many to name. From Zanga, we go further into the jungle, through a quarantine gate into nearby Bakuda. Some 8,000 people live here. No one has been allowed to leave. This community has been completely isolated. Of the over 1,000 deaths from Ebola in Liberia, 20% have died right here in this town. The town chief tells us they're worried if the virus doesn't kill them, hunger and disease will. This is what it's like across Lofa, locked in, afraid, and alone.
Sometimes the county health workers are called in to investigate a case, and when they get there, they discover it's actually one of their own. This clinic had to be locked up after all the health workers in it contracted Ebola. Only one of them survived.
Traveling north from Africa to Europe, President Obama visited Estonia yesterday and met with its president. It was a show of support for America's NATO ally and a kind of warning to Russia not to get involved in other European countries like it's accused of doing in Ukraine. Another subject discussed, ISIS, a terrorist group in Iraq and Syria that slaughtered people who don't agree with its views on Islam. ISIS has executed American journalists. It routinely murders civilians. President Obama has been criticized for being too cautious and having an unclear plan of how to address ISIS. In Estonia, he worked to clarify his policies.
Whatever these murderers think they'll achieve by killing innocent Americans like Stephen, they have already failed. They failed because, like people around the world, Americans are repulsed by their barbarism. We will not be intimidated. Their horrific acts only unite us as a country and stiffen our resolve to take the fight against these terrorists. And those who make the mistake of harming Americans will learn that we will not forget and that our reach is long and that justice will be served.
You've heard of the Al-Qaeda terrorist group. This school year, we've been talking more about ISIS. What is the difference?
ISIS and Al-Qaeda have deep ties and a long history. In fact, when ISIS began during the fight against U.S. forces in Iraq, it was allied with Al-Qaeda and shared a name. It was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And there are other similarities and connections as well. Both these groups sprung from long civil wars. Al-Qaeda, the fight against Russian troops in Afghanistan. ISIS, the fight against American troops in Iraq and later against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Both groups seeking to establish an Islamic state, a so-called caliphate. Also, both of them willing to establish that state, to attack and use brutal violence against both non-Muslims, Americans, Westerners, and Muslims as well. Non-Sunni Muslims, but really any Muslim that they consider not devout enough, not extreme enough. But there are many differences, and it's some of these differences that greatly concern U.S. and other Western officials. ISIS has been able to seize and control much more territory than Al-Qaeda was ever capable of. Today, ISIS controls broad swaths of both Iraq and Syria. 2, U.S. officials tell me consistently that ISIS behaves, it seizes and controls territory very much like a military force, not just a terrorist organization. They're much more difficult to fight. 3, ISIS is largely self-funding. It operates as a government in the territory that it controls, issuing taxes. It also uses extortion and theft to get money, and it even sells oil in areas that it has captured in Iraq and Syria. And by some estimates, it's making $1 million a day or more. Finally, although there were some Westerners who joined al-Qaeda, Anwar al-Awlaki among them, ISIS has proven a much more powerful magnet for Westerners and Americans. It's now believed, U.S. intelligence officials say, that something along the lines of a dozen Americans have joined ISIS and dozens more have joined other extremist groups in Syria. And the great concern is what happens when those Americans, when those Europeans come home? Do they bring jihad with them?
Today's roll call takes us from North Dakota to northeast Pakistan. You can't miss the flashes. They're enlightening Sawyer Public School in Sawyer, North Dakota. The Panthers are on the prowl. We found them at Pikeville High School in Pikeville, Kentucky. And in Southeast Asia, glad to be part of your day at Lahore American School in Lahore, Pakistan. Thank you all for making your requests on Wednesday's transcript page at cnnstudentnews.com. Back in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separating blacks and whites in schools was unconstitutional. It was the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case. But 3 years after that, segregation still existed in some places. Little Rock, Arkansas was one of them. A group of 9 black students was originally blocked from attending Little Rock Central High School. On the first day of school, September 4th, 1957, members of the Arkansas National Guard raised their guns and waved a teenage girl off campus. She'd return until she succeeded and made history. A modern photographer recently captured her in a reunion.
One of my favorite pictures was not of a world leader. It was of the Little Rock Nine. I invited them to come together again in front of the high school where they originally went and kind of changed America. We flew them in from around the world. So there they all are, this epic scene, Gothic high school in the background, and they're all standing in a line, the cultural heroes of our time. And I suddenly felt I'm not qualified to do this. Firstly, I'm white, I'm not black. Secondly, I'm too young. And thirdly, I'm not even American. And there was this lady in the middle of the group. Her name is Elizabeth Eckford. And if you Google her, you'll see footage of her as a 16-year-old little girl, clutching her school books, trying to get into school. And she's separated from her friends by an angry mob of white mothers. And they're pushing her and pulling her about. They do not want her going to school with their white kids. And it's the most horrific side of America you can imagine. So let's move on many, many years. There she is as an elderly lady standing in front of me. And she had her head held high, rather awkwardly like this. So I made a mistake and I said, "Excuse me, my dear," I shouted out, "would you mind lowering your chin so that you can get it in line with everybody else?" And she said, "Young man, don't you ever ask me to lower my chin. I hold my head up high with pride because I'm so proud of what we did. And I will never lower my chin or bow my head ever again." And at that point, they all raised their chin to her level. And then they all held hands. And I caught it on film. I made a social mistake. I never meant any disrespect. But I was quick enough to realize that what I accidentally created was a moment again.
Gabrielle Enright, a reporter in Ohio, had to weather some serious weather this week.
This is not a good scenario to be out in right now.
No, it wasn't. She was outside reporting when a windstorm didn't just flip her umbrella, it crushed it. Despite getting drenched, she and her cameraman kept rolling along, and when everything had dried out, including the umbrella, which somehow survived, she was right back on the air. She gave her viewers some serious flood for thought, and even if she couldn't stand under her umbrella, Ella, it was her resilience that reigned supreme. We'll wrap now in hopes of precipitating Friday. I'm Carl Azuz for CNN Student News.